Okay, so picking up where we left off, we're going to talk about the key principles of muscle contraction. The first one's going to be the all or none law, or the all or none principle. And what this states is that either a muscle fiber contracts or it doesn't contract at all. This means that the sarcomere either shortens or it doesn't shorten. It can't shorten a little bit or shorten a lot. It's all or nothing. So the strength of a contraction then has to do with the amount of motor units that the muscle is stimulated by. And what this means is strength is determined by the amount of muscle fibers that are stimulated by the different motor neurons, which we're going to group into sections we call motor units. So specifically, a motor unit is going to be a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. So if we look at this motor neuron here, we can see it attaches to this muscle fiber, and this muscle fiber down here. So this motor unit would stimulate these three muscle fibers. In reality, it's going to be more than just a couple muscle fibers, but for illustrative sakes, that's what it's going to look like. So one motor neuron can innervate between 2 to 2,000 muscle fibers. I'm sure that number is highly variable, can be much more than that. So here you can see we've added another motor neuron then. So now this one's going to stimulate the bottom half of our muscle. So when we need to determine how much strength we need for a certain action, we're going to call this recruitment. And recruitment's talking about how many motor units the nervous system is going to activate based on need. So if I need to lift up this little pen, I don't really need to stimulate a bunch of motor units. I just need a couple to lift this little weight. If I wanted to lift up this whole desk, my nervous system would initiate a bunch more motor units to increase the amount of strength needed. So when we talk about how muscles get the energy source for contraction, the main player is going to be ATP. Again, this stands for adenosine triphosphate. And this is going to be the universal unit of energy for all cells. So not just muscle fibers or muscle cells. Every cell in the universe that we know of is basically going to use ATP as their source of energy. And the reason this is important is because when those myosin heads pull on those actin filaments, the ability for the myosin head to get in that cocked position is going to be determined by if ATP binds to the site on the myosin head or not. And if you remember, it's going to be made in the mitochondria. And because muscle cells need a lot of ATP, it means that they're going to have lots of mitochondria within that sarcoplasm. So here we can see a simplified kind of version of the ATP molecule. And when we look at it, it's going to have 3 phosphates. So again, adenosine is going to be this gray area over here. And then the triphosphate means there's going to be 3 phosphate bonds. So when we look, here's the first bond, second bond, and third phosphate bond. And what's going to happen is when this ATP molecule is hydrolyzed by H2O, it's going to break off that third phosphate bond. And when it does that, a large source of energy is going to be released that the cell can take advantage of. And if you look, we go back, we can see that when we get rid of the 1 phosphate, now we're going to have 2 phosphates left. And we're going to call this new molecule adenosine diphosphate, di for 2. And again, if we were to cut off this second phosphate bond, we would call it AMP for adenosine monophosphate, which we don't need to concern ourselves with, but it is possible. So how do we make ATP then? The 2 main components are going to be oxygen and glucose. After they go through the entire process, our leftover products are going to be CO2, which we breathe out, and we're going to create water molecules as well as the resulting ATP that the cells can use. So because oxygen is so important to maintain the production of ATP, and muscles need a good source of it, we're going to store some oxygen in our muscle tissue in a protein called myoglobin. Within the sarcoplasm, we're going to have a bunch of myoglobin that stores the oxygen. So if we're not able to breathe it in, we still have some reserves that can maintain the production of ATP that's necessary to finish our energy expenditure. Also, myoglobin is going to be what gives muscle its red color. So when we talk about light meat and dark meat, say if you're eating chicken, meat that is lighter is going to have less myoglobin, whereas meat that is darker is going to have more myoglobin. So in a chicken, we find our dark meat in the wings and the legs, because wings and legs are going to have a lot of action and contraction involved in it, so they're going to have more myoglobin. Whereas the chest, the chickens don't fly, so they don't need nearly as much ATP. The second ingredient is going to be glucose. Glucose is what we're going to ingest through our diet to feed this reaction. And because glucose is also important for this, muscles are going to have their own store of it in a protein called glycogen. Glycogen you'll find both in muscles as well as the liver. When muscle breaks down the glycogen, it makes more ATP in a process called glycolysis, is what we're going to look at next. So there's two types of respiration, or two ways of making ATP. There is one with the oxygen and one without oxygen. So we're going to first look at the pathway without oxygen. So this is going to be called the anaerobic pathway, or the anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic, and meaning without, aerobic meaning oxygen. And this is going to be the first stage of glycolysis. And if we look at the term glycolysis as well, glyco is going to mean glucose, and lysis, if you have a lysosome or if something's lysed, it means it's going to be broken up. So glycolysis means the breaking up of glucose. So here we have our glucose molecule. We don't need to concern ourselves so much with the molecular formula, but you can see it has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And again, with anaerobic respiration, oxygen is not going to be needed to produce the resulting ATP. This is going to occur in the cytoplasm, so the mitochondria is not involved in this anaerobic process. But because there's no oxygen, the resulting amount of ATP is very diminished compared to the aerobic respiration. So we're only going to produce a net total of 2 molecules of ATP. So it's not going to be able to sustain energy for a very long time, just for short bursts. So you can say it contributes to about 10 to 30 seconds of energy. Some sources say up to 60 seconds, but the key idea is it's not going to sustain energy for a long period of time. And then we have lactic acid, also called lactate, and this is going to be a byproduct of anaerobic respiration. We're going to look more closely into lactic acid because as massage therapists, it's very common to hear our colleagues, and this isn't just massage therapists, but anybody within the field, they're going to say lactic acid has a lot to do with muscle soreness, especially with exercise. This was definitely a prevailing theory for many, many decades. But within the last 10 or 20 years or so, it's been pretty well determined that lactic acid isn't a bad guy. It's not something that we can get rid of or that we'd want to get rid of. Lactic acid's actually going to help us, our muscles function more optimally. So I'm going to kind of run through this whole metabolic process to kind of show you why that is, because even though it's not quite important for the MBLEX or even our test, you'll definitely hear clients talk about lactic acid, especially your coworkers. So it's important to understand its actual role in muscle physiology. So we'll look at that in a little bit. So again, we have our glucose molecule. It's going to go through the glycolysis. There's definitely a lot of intermediate steps here, but the end result is it's going to break up the glucose into 2 molecules called pyruvate. And you can see here, we started with 6 carbons. Now we have 3 carbons in one pyruvate and 6 carbons in another pyruvate. And then our 2 resulting ATPs. So if we do have oxygen, we still go through this first phase of anaerobic respiration, but these pyruvates are going to make their way into the mitochondria when oxygen is present. And this pyruvate then is going to kick off the aerobic respiration part of the metabolic chain. So now, looking at aerobic respiration with our pyruvate inside of the mitochondria, the key thing with aerobic respiration that I want you to know, it's going to produce around 30 to 38 ATP molecules. So we're making about 15 times the amount of energy compared to anaerobic without oxygen. So there's going to be multiple cycles here that we'll quickly look at. The first one is going to be what we call the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. And the whole goal of this chemical pathway is to produce molecules that are enriched with electrons. These are going to be called NADH and FADH. And you can see here highlighted the NAD and the NADH. And when we say that they're electron rich, you can see we start with NAD+. If you remember, that plus means it has 1 less electron than protons. So it's going to get rid of this, it's going to add an electron here, and now we're going to lose that ionization, and we're not going to be an even molecule. So you can see when we go from NAD plus to NADH, it means we've gained electrons. So all along this cycle, we're trying to put electrons on these molecules that are going to be fed later into the system. So as we finish the Krebs cycle, we're going to then end up what we call the electron transport chain. And basically what this means is electrons that we've stored in those NADH molecules and FAD, we're going to use those electrons to pump hydrogen ions to one side of this membrane. So what this means then, when we move all these hydrogen ions to one side of the dam or one side of the membrane, we're creating this concentration gradient that we're going to use to produce energy. So as the hydrogen ions go down their concentration gradients, they're going to pass through this complex called the ATP synthase. And as the hydrogens pass through, this is the molecular machinery that's going to put the ATP molecule together. So this is what builds the ATP, this ATP synthase. And finally, the reason oxygen is important is because oxygen is going to be what we call the final electron acceptor. So as these electrons go through these complexes and pump hydrogen ions through, there's going to need to be somewhere for these electrons to go to. And that's the role of oxygen. Oxygen is going to accept these electrons so they don't cause damage. And then it's going to also bind with the hydrogen that comes through. And this is where we get H2O resulting from the products of that reaction. So again, we have H2O as a product as well as CO2 from earlier that we're going to breathe out. So the problem is if we don't, and basically it's going to create about 34, like I said, 30 to 38 molecules of ATP, depending on how you want to count it. But the reason oxygen is important is when we don't have any oxygen, we can't really use this electron transport chain, and the whole system gets backed up, and that's when we end up with problems. So without the oxygen, we have anaerobic conditions, and as we said, with the hydrolysis of this ATP molecule, one of the products of this reaction here is we're going to have this extra hydrogen proton that exists as a result. And again, with intense exercise, we're breaking down a lot of ATP, and that means we're going to have a whole lot of hydrogen ions floating around with inside of the cell. So as these hydrogen ions accumulate, if you remember when we talked about acids and bases, all an acid is an accumulation of hydrogen ions. So with all these hydrogen ions floating around, we now have this acidic environment within the muscle tissue, and this is going to lower the pH significantly. And this is not going to be a good scenario for homeostasis. So we need a way to prevent or to combat or buffer this accumulation of hydrogen ions. And this is where lactate acid is going to come in. So when we talk about lactate, if you remember, we have these two pyruvate molecules, and in a low oxygen condition, pyruvate is going to be transformed or converted into a molecule called lactate. And lactate's job is to buffer all these hydrogen ions. So you can see when lactate comes into existence, it's going to accommodate binding with a bunch of these hydrogen ions. So it's going to take the hydrogen out of the tissue and significantly buffer the acidic conditions within the muscle tissue. So lactate isn't a bad guy. Lactate is going to act as a buffer to try to keep the muscles performing longer than they normally would. So it does this by binding the extra hydrogen ions to prevent acidosis. So quick side note, I do want to talk about rigor mortis because I think it highlights a lot of the things we just talked about in the previous couple slides. So with rigor mortis, happens when the organism dies. And if you don't know, rigor mortis is going to be when your muscular system, your body becomes very stiff after death. So we can explain exactly why that happens as we go through the steps that involve the sliding filament theory. So after death, the calcium ions that are typically stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, they're now going to start leaking out of that SR. And you can see when they leak out, they're going to go within those T tubules and they're going to activate that troponin. And this is going to cause one last sustained muscle contraction. This is where the stiffness comes from. And also because we're dead, we're not bringing in any more oxygen, so we're not going to be able to produce any more ATP. And if you remember when we talked about those myosin heads binding and unbinding, the myosin head needs ATP to separate itself from the actin molecule. So because there's no ATP, we now can't separate those myosin and actin heads, so the muscle is going to stay in a contracted state for many hours, up to 12 hours, I'd say. But eventually the cells are going to continue to break down and decompose because of just general breakdown after death. The lysosomes are going to leak out of the cells, and those lysosomes are acidic. They're going to start, or the garbage disposal cells, they're going to start to break down the proteins even more. Eventually, they're going to break down the actin and myosin filaments, and this makes the muscles permanently go limp. Looking at the types of skeletal muscles, there's going to be two major types of skeletal muscles. You've probably heard of them. Their official names are type 1 and type 2, but they're more commonly known as slow twitch and fast twitch. So type 1 is going to be a slow twitch muscle, and slow twitch, what we need to know about them is that they're high endurance muscle fibers, meaning that they resist fatigue easily. So an Olympic level or any kind of marathon rider is going to have a lot of slow twitch muscles to be able to maintain their endurance for hours at a time. And they're able to do this because they contain a lot of myoglobin and mitochondria. So basically, they're very good at maintaining ATP supplies. They also contract more slowly and longer, so they're not as powerful as other types of muscles. But good examples are going to be the erector spinae and the lower extremities. So humans are well known for their ability to run long distances. 26 miles, not a whole lot of organisms are able to maintain that kind of endurance. So this is special to humans' running ability. Whereas type 2 muscle fibers are going to be the fast twitch. The thing you want to know about fast twitch is that they fatigue quickly, but they're fast and powerful. So when we're talking about fast twitch muscles, then we're talking about weightlifting, powerlifting, high energy sports type of athletes. They're going to have less mitochondrium and myoglobin, meaning this is why they fatigue easily. They can't keep up with the aerobic respiration demands of the activity. But more specifically, their myosin works a little bit faster, so it can pull that actin faster than a slow twitch, and they're better at releasing the calcium from the SR. So examples would be the upper extremity muscles. So the pecs, the chest, the arms are very good at that. We can break down muscle fibers into different classifications, describing the way in which the fibers are oriented. So these are very simple. I don't like to get into them too much because there's a lot of overlap in here, but you will see these terms occasionally come up, but I wouldn't worry a whole lot about them, and they're pretty self-explanatory. So the first type we're going to look at is parallel muscle fibers, and parallel meaning that they all run in one direction. So in this case, they're running along the long axis of the bone. So here we're looking at biceps brachii. It's running all along the axis of the humerus. Specific type of parallel muscle is going to be the fusiform. And all fusiform means is that they're going to taper off at the end. So you can see these muscle fibers taper off into long tendons, both proximally and distally. So we would say this is a fusiform muscle. Convergent muscles are going to be when the fibers, the origin usually is going to be large or wide at one end, and the fibers gather together and insert into a small attachment point at the insertion. So they join at one end and fan out at the other. An example here, this is going to be pectoralis major. Sometimes you'll see these described as triangular muscles because of their triangular shape. And because these fibers are pulling in multiple directions due to their wide origin, this allows them to pull in multiple planes of the body. So fibers that run in this direction on an oblique angle are going to be able to pull through multiple planes. These horizontal fibers are going to pull through that transverse or horizontal plane. And these lower fibers are also going to pull in multiple planes because of their oblique angle. The next type of classification of muscle fibers is going to be the spiral muscle. And all this is there's going to be a twist in the muscle fibers between the two attachment points. So a good example is going to be latissimus dorsi, where our origin is on the posterior aspect of the back. And then as we insert on that bicipital groove of the humerus, there's going to be a twist in the muscle fibers. So if we look closely, we can see how these fibers spiral and insert onto that anterior aspect of the humerus. And this is going to again allow for action of multiple planes. There's going to be muscles that are circular in shape. Basically, there's just a rounded arrangement of fibers here. So a good example that we're looking at here is orbicularis oculi. Again, orbit is for circular, oculi is eye, so the circular muscle around the eye. You can see there's also going to be one around the mouth called orbicularis oris. And then another is going to be all the sphincters in the body. So we haven't looked at the digestive system or more of the organ systems, but the dividing points between a lot of the intestines, we're going to have sphincters that are able to open and close to keep things in and out, and they're going to have a circular arrangement as well. So many different examples of sphincters in the body. And lastly, we have the pennate muscle fibers. These are going to be fibers that extend out like a feather, and we're going to classify them depending on which way that they fan out or extend out. So if you see unipennate, uni meaning one, it means the fibers come out from one side. So here we have the tendon, or the tendon here, and the fibers come out just the one side. Whereas when we have a bipennate, it means that we have a central tendon where the fibers come out from both sides. So this is the classic feather-like shape. And finally, we would just have a multipennate muscle. So one of the best examples is going to be the deltoid muscle. If you remember, the deltoid has three different heads: the anterior, the middle, and the posterior. So again, this is all one muscle, so there's going to have many, many different directions of those muscle fibers. So we're going to call that multipennate. Here I included just the general all-encompassing picture to help you review. Again, I don't like to concentrate on this much because there is a lot of overlap. For example, latissimus dorsi is going to be a spiral muscle as well as convergent muscle. So I wouldn't get too hung up on these terms. This is going to be more of a review when we quickly talk about the parts of the muscle. So if you remember, the origin is going to be the less movable attachment. Less movable is always going to be relative to the insertion point. So here, this is kind of a fill-in for the upper trapezius. So we have the origin at the base of the skull here because the skull is going to be less movable relative to the scapula. Again, if you remember, origins are usually more centralized, so medial on the body, and insertions are going to be more lateral. When we talk about the belly, we're talking about the muscle fibers themselves, so the area between the two attachment points. And then the insertion is the more movable attachment. So in this scenario here, our scapula is going to be the insertion. And then when this muscle contracts, so sarcomere shorten, we're going to pull at both ends, but because this one's more movable, this is the one that's going to be pulled towards the origin. So in this case, we have elevation and upward rotation of the scapula. But this is only a general rule. There are scenarios in which the origin can be pulled towards the insertion. And when this happens, it's going to be known as functional reversibility. Functional reversibility is when the origin goes towards the insertion. And when this happens is if we hold this insertion stationary, whether it is maybe I have a heavy weight in my arm and I'm pulling down on the scapula through the chain of my upper arm muscles, now our scapula is going to be less movable relative to the origin. So then what would happen in this case, we hold down the scapula and you can see it can no longer elevate and upwardly rotate. We've stopped it from doing that. But these muscle fibers are still going to contract and they're still going to pull on those two attachment points. But because we're not holding the head still, when those muscle fibers contract, we're now going to move the origin closer to the insertion. So in this case, we're laterally flexing the head and possibly also extending it as well. So this would be an example of functional reversibility. You will see this more in the hip and leg muscles. Some real quick other classifications. We can just call muscles different names depending on how many joints that muscle crosses. So again, we're going to see these prefixes uni, bi, and multi. So uniarticular, articular meaning joint, is a muscle that crosses one joint. So brachioradialis, we haven't learned this muscle yet, but brachio is going to be the upper arm, radialis is going to be the radius of the forearm. So we're talking about a muscle that crosses the elbow joint. just one joint there, so we're going to call brachioradialis uniarticular. Biarticular is going to be a muscle that crosses two joints, so the triceps or biceps is going to cross both the shoulder and the elbow, so biarticular. And then anything that crosses more than two, we're just going to group together into a multi-articular classification. So a good example would be the erector spinae, the muscles that go all the way up and down the vertebrae. So each of these vertebrae are going to count as a joint. So a muscle that goes across all of them is going to be a muscle that crosses 24 joints. So we would call it multi-articular. Again, when we talk about muscle actions, we're going to classify the different types of muscles depending on what they're doing to the joint when they're contracting. So if you remember, an agonist is also going to be known as a prime mover. An agonist is going to be the muscle that's primarily responsible for performing the desired movement. So here in this kind of simplified diagram, we have biceps brachii going here from the supraglenoid tubercle down to the radial tuberosity. So this is going to be the prime mover of elbow flexion. Prime mover because it's the largest muscle, so it's going to be responsible for the majority of the power associated with that movement. But because we want to only move certain joints, in this case, like I said, the biceps brachii crosses the shoulder and the elbow. So if we were to contract unimpeded by anything else, both the shoulder and the elbow would move, but we don't want to move the shoulder. We just want to bend the elbow. So we're going to utilize muscles that also act on the shoulder to help stabilize it or fix it in place. So these muscles that fix other joints in place are known as fixator muscles. So they're a special type of synergist that stabilize a joint. So the example here would be teres major, would prevent the shoulder from flexing because it's also teres major is an extensor muscle. And then to help the agonist, we're going to have muscles known as synergists that help the prime mover perform their job. So the example here would be pronator teres, also an elbow flexor, but you can see it's much, much smaller than biceps brachii. So it's not going to be responsible for the bulk of the movement, but it will assist it. And this is going to be true for basically every joint in the body. The way the body's been set up is you don't want one muscle responsible for performing the entire action of that joint. Where if you only had one muscle as an elbow flexor, if you were to injure it, then you'd have no way of ever flexing that elbow again. So you're going to have kind of backup muscles as well as helper muscles to perform these motions in case of injury and whatnot. So again, here we can see the pronator teres has helped the biceps brachii, but the humerus has stayed stationary thanks to the teres major. But whenever you have an agonist, you're going to need an opposing muscle that's able to relax and stretch to accommodate the movement of that joint. So this opposing muscle is going to be what we term the antagonist. So antagonist is the muscle on the opposite side of the joint that's going to relax while that agonist contracts. So here we can see biceps brachii is nice and contracted, or the triceps is stretched out and accommodating that motion. If this weren't relaxed, you'd have no movement at all because they'd be opposing each other with equal forces, and you'd have a stiff body. And you see this in certain types of cerebral palsy or other muscular disorders where there's a failure of communication between the agonist and antagonist, and you have dysfunctions of movement. So here, like we said, agonist biceps, antagonist triceps. Whereas these roles are going to reverse when we want to extend the elbow. Now we call the triceps the agonist because this is what's responsible for the extension. And now the biceps is the antagonist because this is the one that has to relax. So again, these terms agonist and antagonist are relative depending on which motion we're talking about with each specific joint. So they go back and forth depending. To help with the antagonist relaxing, there's a neural phenomenon called reciprocal inhibition. And this is in reference to the antagonist being forced to relax. So the nervous system is going to basically prevent the antagonist from getting any signal from a motor neuron that could possibly stimulate to contract. So we basically shut down the ability of the antagonist to contract for a little while the agonist is doing the contracting. So the nervous system is responsible for keeping this communication in balance and not messing up the smoothness of the movement. So again, that's reciprocal. It's called reciprocal because reciprocal is going to be the opposite. So we're talking about the opposite of the agonist, and inhibition means it's preventing. So it's preventing the opposite muscle from doing its job. It's inhibiting it. So again, it's those antagonist motor nerves that are inhibited. And we're going to look at the kind of an up-close diagram of how that works at the end of this chapter. When we talk about types of contractions, there's going to be more than just one type. There's going to be different definitions depending on how the work is being performed. So if the muscle is changing lengths while generating force, we're going to call this isotonic. Iso meaning same, tone meaning the tone of the muscle itself. So as the joint moves up and down, the tone is going to remain the same, meaning it's generating force. And this can be broken up into two main descriptions. When we talk about a concentric contraction, it means the muscle's shortening. So in the case of the elbow, when that biceps contracts, it's going to be called a concentric contraction because we're shortening the distance between the joint and we're making the muscle fibers contract smaller. The opposite of this is going to be what we call eccentric contraction. And this is when the muscle lengthens, but is also maintaining or generating force. And like I said earlier, this is going to be what allows for smooth, controlled movements as we put the weight back down. So as we gently put this weight back down, this is going to be an eccentric contraction. And if you've ever lifted weights, eccentric contractions are very important because as that muscle is moving down, the muscle fibers are trying to hold on tightly, those myosin actin heads, but as you stretch them out, there's going to be small tears within those muscle fibers. And as that tearing occurs with eccentric contractions, that's what's going to allow for the muscle to get bigger because it's those small micro tears that after they heal, the muscle regenerates, the muscle cells repair themselves, and they're going to get bigger. So it's the eccentric contraction of lifting weights that really helps build larger muscle mass. And I don't have the last one on here. I accidentally left it off. But the third type is going to be isometric. So isometric means, metric meaning length, iso meaning the same. An isometric contraction is going to be when you maintain a steady joint as you're generating force. So an example is I was holding a weight out in front of me. My arm isn't moving, but I'm still using my muscles to hold the weight up. So another example would be if you did like a wall squat with your legs just bent, you're going to quickly feel burning within those thigh muscles. So you're going to give them a workout even though you're not producing any movement. Same thing with something like a plank. Instead of doing a sit-up where you're moving your trunk up and down or flexing and extending, a plank you're maintaining a completely still frame, but you're still going to get a good core workout, both in the erectors as well as the abdominals. So again, that's isometric. Again, let's see if I can spell that a little bit better. I'm practicing with my new pen. Metric. There you go. That's the third type. And that's going to be same length. And then we're just going to fit this last kind of section in. We talked about connective tissue in the histology chapter, so we've already been introduced to fascia. So if you remember, fascia is just a general term for the connective tissue, and we're going to classify it by the location. So when we talk about superficial fascia, superficial meaning that it's closer to the surface of the body, so it's the fascia just beneath the skin. So if we kind of break things down into layers, we have our skin at the most superficial, and then we're going to have superficial or cutaneous fat just below that skin. And within those layers of adipose, this is where you'll find the superficial fascia. And the thing with superficial fascia is, while it does connect things together, it's a very loose connection, so it allows for the ability for the skin to move easily. So if we were to massage and push against that skin, the superficial fascia is going to accommodate movement all along the area. So superficial fascia is going to be moved back and forth. So this is when you have scar tissue and contractures, you're going to lose that ability for the superficial fascia to accommodate that type of motion. But with regular body tissue, this is very easy to feel and even see on yourself. And again, that makes sense because when you flex and extend the joint, the skin has to be able to stretch to accommodate that motion as well. Whereas when we talk about deep fascia, this is going to be the fascia that exists below the superficial fascia. So the fascia that encompasses the muscles or is just above the muscles. So when we talked about the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium, these were examples of deep fascia. So tendons, ligaments, all deep fascia. Again, here we look at a cross-section of the thigh, the femur being here, and the quadriceps, hamstrings, and adductors. You can see this deep fascia is going to form compartments around the different muscles, and this is going to help accommodate motion between the different muscles themselves. So this is a good way to kind of show the different layers or compartments that the deep fascia help create. Tendons we talked about. Tendons going to be part of that deep fascia, and the important thing with tendons is it's going to anchor muscle to bone. Again, tendons are muscle to bone, whereas a ligament is going to be bone to bone. So again, don't mix that up. Tendons have to do with muscles. One of my former students like to kind of remember this by saying tendons are bending. Bending because they're involved with muscle contraction and action. Ligaments, again, no movement. They're going to be what hold the skeletal system together and maintain that structure. An aponeurosis is going to be a fancy term for just a broad, flat tendon. So whenever you see a body without the skin on, you see these large white areas. Again, white is going to signify connective tissue, red, muscle fibers. So an example of an aponeurosis is going to be the abdominal aponeurosis of the abs, or if there's thoracolumbar on the backside. But again, we're just talking about a broad, flat tendon. And the last one I want you guys to know is going to be something we call retinaculum. Retinaculum is going to be a strap of tendon sheath that's going to help stabilize and hold tendons in place. So at areas of the body where you have kind of these bends or joints, you're going to need to keep those tendons of the muscles above the joint close to the body. So it's the job of the retinaculum to kind of act as a sleeve to keep those tendons where they belong. So you'll find these at the elbows, knees, ankles, and wrists. The most common one that you've probably heard of before is going to be the retinaculum of the carpal tunnel. So when people have carpal tunnel syndrome, there's going to be kind of a buildup of connective tissue or a buildup of that retinaculum, and it's going to kind of impinge on the size of that tunnel as you build up the tissue of that retinaculum from overuse. And it's going to impinge the nerve passing underneath as well as the tendons of the forearm muscles. All right, and getting close to the end of the chapter, I do want to talk about levers and lever systems. So when we talk about how muscles function, they're going to function very similar or just like the way a lever functions. When we talk about levers, it's basically just a simple machine that makes performing certain actions easier depending on how we set it up. So when we talk about levers, there's going to be three major components that make up what a lever is. So the first one is going to be the fulcrum, and this is going to be the pivot point. So if this is our seesaw, this is going to be the fulcrum in the center. And then on each side of that fulcrum, we're going to have different components. So on the one side, we're going to have the load. In the case of the body, this is going to be the weight of the body or the weight of the limb that we're trying to move. And on the other side, we have the force or the effort where the effort occurs. And this is the spot where the muscle does the pulling. So there's going to be three different classes of levers. So we're kind of going to look at each one and why they help aid in muscle performance. So here we have our load. This is a safe, let's say it weighs 50 pounds. So a heavy object. If we were to just try to pick it up off the ground, it's going to be too heavy for us to lift. So what we can do is we can create a lever that makes our work easier. And the way this works is with something called a class 1 lever, you're able to direct force down to lift something up. So when you try to lift that shape up from the ground normally, we're working against gravity as well, and that's going to make things tough. Whereas with the lever, you can see here, we're now able to push down so we can work with gravity to lift something up. So say if I weighed 100 pounds and sat on the other side of this, I wouldn't have to do any work because the weight of my body pushing down with gravity would lift this weight. So this is the advantage of a class 1 lever. So here you can see, if I push down with 50 pounds, I can lift 50 pounds, and we've moved equal distance. So 2 feet up and 2 feet down, and we've moved it equally. And when this happens when the fulcrum's in the middle, you need an equal force pushing down to lift the load going up. But we can change this scenario, whereas if we move the fulcrum closer to the load, we've now lengthened this effort arm on this side. And what this means is with a longer lever arm, we can use less weight to lift the same amount of load. So here we can push down with 25 pounds of force, and we're still able to lift the 50 pounds. So basically, when you move the fulcrum closer to the load, you're going to trade increased distance. So because even though we have to use less weight or effort to push down, we now have to travel a longer distance to lift the weight a little bit less. So in this scenario, we've pushed 3 feet, we've only lifted 1 foot, but we've used less force. When we describe this then, we can call these different parts of the lever the effort arm. The effort arm is going to be the part where we push down on or lift up on, or in the case with our bodies where our muscles pull. And the load arm is going to be the part in which the weight exists. So again, when we change the length of the load and effort arm, we've changed how much energy or how much distance we need to move. So a good way to kind of look at this is the longer the effort arm, the more force the lever can produce. So the further I move this fulcrum over, the larger load I can lift. A famous quote by, I believe it was Archimedes, said he could move the world with a long enough lever. So basically, there's no limit to how well a lever can work besides how big you're able to make it. So an example of a class 1 lever in the body then is going to be the occipito-atlanto or the atlanto-occipital joint of the cervical and the head. So the fulcrum is going to be C1 as well as the occipital bone, where you can allow for shaking your head yes and no. So when we put the muscles on, you can see if we want to pull our head back, this trapezius part is going to be the force meaning the trapezius is contracting. And as it contracts, it's going to lift the whole weight of the anterior aspect of the head. So the anterior aspect of the head is going to be the load. We can reverse this lever, whereas if our sternocleidomastoid muscle in the front, when that contracts, now we've made the force in the front of the body, and we've lifted the back of the head, which is the load. So again, our head's going to pivot around this fulcrum of the vertebrae. So we can see again, force going down when you extend, and then force going down in the front when you contract the SCMs. So we can kind of reverse this class 1 lever, and we can exchange the amount of effort put in as for increase in distance. So if the load of the arm is longer, we get increased, we're going to need increased effort, but we're going to result in a greater distance. So kind of a classic example of this. So again, a short, powerful movement of the effort arm for increased distance or speed in the load arm. So we're going to use more effort to move things more quickly. The classic example of this would be an oar on a rowboat. Here, our fulcrum is going to be the part where the oar touches the boat. Our effort arm is going to be this little tiny handle, and the load arm is going to be the long part of the paddle. And you can see how long this load arm is. So the longer the load arm, the more energy we're going to need to be able to move this, but we're going to move it a long distance. So It's going to take a lot of effort to move with 1 foot, but we're going to result in 6 feet of motion. And what this means is that we're going to be able to paddle the boat very quickly. So that's what, if you reverse a class 1 lever, you're exchanging the amount of force needed for the distance that you get out of it. Looking at a class 2 lever then, we're going to move the fulcrum all the way to the one side, and now we have the load arm closer to the fulcrum and the effort arm on the distal aspect. And what the difference is between class 1 is now the force and load are both traveling the same direction. Whereas if you remember with class 1, the load was going down and the force was going up. That is no longer the case with the class 2 lever. Both of these are going up now. So as we look, the longer this effort arm, again, the more distance we have to move, but we can lift this load arm just as well. So the longer the effort arm, the easier it is will be to lift this load. So again, when the effort arm changes, becomes smaller, we can't lift the load nearly as much. It's going to be even heavier. So we want this load as close to the fulcrum as possible and the effort arm as long as possible. So a good example of this would be a wheelbarrow. Here the wheel is going to be the fulcrum, the load is going to be what we put in the bucket, and the force is when we lift up on the handle. So a classic example of a class 2 lever. So there's only going to be basically one of these levers in the body that I'm aware of, and that's going to be of the ankle joint. So here at our distal metatarsals, we're going to have our fulcrum. And then as our posterior calf muscles like gastrocnemius and soleus contract, they're going to pull up on the heel to lift it up. So our force is going to be generated by these posterior calf muscles to pull up the weight of the body. And when we talk about the load is going to be the entire weight of the body. So when we go up on our tippy toes, we're lifting the entire weight of our body. So in this case, we're giving up distance for the ease of lifting up weight. So what this is going to look like, gastroc pulls, we've lifted up the heel and the entire load of the body has followed with it. So as far as class 1 and class 2, there aren't a lot of examples in the body of that. The vast majority of muscles in the body are going to work through class 3 levers. And this is when a large force is applied to move the load a great distance. So basically we have the same setup as a class 2, but now we've changed the load arm and the effort arm, we've changed places. So the effort arm is now closer to the fulcrum and the load arm is much longer, much heavier. But again, both the force and load are going in the same direction. So what's going to happen, we're going to put a lot of effort on this effort arm, and we're going to be able to move that load a great distance, but it's not going to be easy to do. It's going to use a lot of energy, so we're sacrificing strength for speed and distance. And that's important for organisms like us. We don't need to be super strong, we just need to be able to move quickly. So the ability for our arms and legs to move is better than the ability to lift very heavy objects. So class 3 levers are going to be set up very similar to this, so let's look at an example. So a good example would be, say, of the shoulder joint. So here we have our glenohumeral socket, or glenohumeral joint, and our fulcrum is going to be where the head of the humerus fits in that glenoid cavity. Here we have our supraspinatus muscle. So if you remember, supraspinatus is going to insert on this greater tubercle. So very basically tippy top of the humerus. And then that's going to be the effort arm, whereas the load arm is going to be the entire length of the humerus. So if you remember our diagram, the longer the load arm, the harder it's going to be to move with more energy needed, but we're going to get great distance with it. So when that supraspinatus contracts, we're going to be able to move that humerus very far. So it's going to take a good amount of force, but we get a good distance in movement. So again, the body is going to sacrifice strength for increased movement. Another example here, we could look at the elbow. So here we have A, B, and C. So if we look, here's our biceps brachii. So this is where the effort's going to come from. So our load arm, or our entire lever, is going to be the forearm. And here we can see This is where the tendon attaches to the radius from the biceps. So here we can divide our lever. Everything over here is going to be the effort arm. And this entire aspect of the forearm is the load arm. So B is the load arm, A is going to be the effort, and C is the fulcrum. So we have our weight here. The biceps is going to contract. It's going to pull on the lever at this point, and we're going to get great distance, but it's going to take a lot of energy and expenditure of the biceps to be able to perform that motion. All right, and then the final section for this chapter, we're going to be talking about proprioception. Proprioception is going to be a fancy word for our subconscious ability to perceive our body position and self-movement. So I know where my body is in space. Even if my eyes are closed, I know where my arms, hands, and legs exist around me. And I can slowly touch my nose if I wanted to. I can touch my fingertips. And I can do this without looking because I have an internal sense of where my body is naturally. And the way we're able to do this, or part of the way, is going to be through these sensory receptors that are embedded all throughout our muscular system. And these receptors are called proprioceptors. Sensory meaning that they're going to send signals or information from the body to the brain. These are the opposite of motor receptors or motor neurons, which send signals from the brain to the muscles. So again, they're going to be found in both muscles, tendons, as well as joints. And their job is to detect changes in both stretch and tension. So how long our muscles are and how much tension our muscles are generating through contraction. So the two main types of proprioceptors that we need to understand are going to be what we call muscle spindles. These are going to be the sensory receptors that are sensitive to stretch. And the other type is called a Golgi tendon organ. And these are going to be sensitive to tension. So these are going to work together to help us understand where our body is. So the first one we're going to look at is a muscle spindle. So what we want to know about muscles, or muscle spindles, is that they're going to exist inside the center of the muscle. So here we just have a generic muscle, and up in this corner we have our spinal cord. So this is where we're going to report information from our muscle to the nervous system. So in red we have our skeletal muscle. We didn't talk about the specific name, but these are called extrafusal muscle fibers. Extra meaning they're on the outside of the muscle. So when you think of skeletal muscle fibers, you usually think of extrafusal. And the reason I'm including this technical term is because when we look at muscle spindles, they're going to exist in a special type of muscle fiber called an intrafusal muscle fiber. Don't worry so much about what intrafusal muscle fibers are capable of. The idea is that they're not attached to the attachment points. So when they contract, they're not going to be generating force or pulling the muscle. They're specifically for reporting tension or stretch to the nervous system. So around these intrafusal muscle fibers, our sensory neuron, the muscle spindle, is going to coil around it, and then the axon is going to go all the way up into the spinal cord. So what's going to happen, along with this pathway then, we also have our motor neuron. So the signal from the spinal cord is going to go all the way down and go to the extrafusal muscle fibers. So we've seen this motor neuron before. The spindle cell is the new one. Okay, so now that we have this whole picture set up, let's look at what happens when we stretch this muscle fiber, this muscle too much. So here we're going to go, and you can see we now have excessive stretch within these muscle fibers. So what's going to happen here is because these intrafusal muscle fibers are stretched, we've pulled on this coil surrounding that muscle cell, and now this is going to send an extra potential to the spinal cord. So this is going to stimulate the muscle spindle, send the signal to the muscle fiber. And you can see here, this neuron is going to communicate with the motor neuron. So it's going to, what we call as a synapse, and it's going to relay the signal to the motor neuron. So this is going to tell the motor neuron, hey, we've overstretched the muscle. We're going to send an extra potential down the motor neuron, and motor neurons are going to tell the muscle to contract. So it's going to quickly cause the muscle to contract, and this quick contraction is what we call the stretch reflex. So the stretch reflex is going to be when the motor neuron quickly tells the muscle to contract itself. So the reason we want to do this is if we kept overstretching and stretching and stretching, we would start to cause damage and tear those muscle fibers. So to prevent further damage or any more damage, these spindle cells are going to tell the motor neurons to quick fire and short up to prevent that overstretching. So if we look at it all together then, we're going to excessively stretch, stimulate the muscle spindle cell, stimulate the motor neuron to form the stretch reflex, and it pulls the muscle back together in a quick contraction. So a classic example of this is something we've all experienced, or we should have all experienced, is when you go to the doctor and they do the reflex test on your quadriceps tendon. The reason your leg kicks out when he hits your tendon is going to be explained through the pathway of the muscle spindle. So what's going to happen is when that doctor hits that quadriceps tendon, that quick impact is going to deform that tendon and cause a quick stretch within that connective tissue, within that muscle fiber, and that muscle, that stretch is going to be picked up by the spindle cell here. So again, if you look, we hit, you can see the muscle spindle small here. We hit the tendon with the hammer. Now we've caused a stretch response. So it's going to send the signal to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, we're going to synapse onto the motor neuron, and it's going to tell the quadriceps to contract, and it'll kick your leg out. And to ensure that this system works, if you remember, this is our agonist here, we need to also send a signal to the antagonist, the hamstrings, and make sure that they relax and don't contract at the same time, or else we wouldn't get any motion whatsoever. So along with that, so we need to make sure the antagonist muscle relaxes at the same time. So to do that, we're also going to have what we call an inhibitory neuron synapsing with this spindle cell at the same time. So at the same time that we're telling this motor neuron to fire, we're also telling this inhibitory neuron to fire as well. And because we call it an inhibitory neuron, its job is to inhibit the neuron on the other side of the synapse. So when you stimulate an inhibitory neuron, we're going to tell this motor neuron to shut up. So basically we're inhibiting any signal from being transmitted to the antagonist muscle. So when this happens, no signal means relaxation. So we've told the agonist to contract, we've now told the antagonist to relax, and this is when you're going to kick out your leg in a reflex. The other important point to notice here is when we talk about a reflex, it means it's something that happens involuntarily. And involuntarily means the brain's not involved. So this entire sequence happens below the brain, meaning that it doesn't involve any thought whatsoever. And it also means it can happen very quickly. If it went to the brain, it'd have to travel much farther up the spinal cord, be processed in the brain, travel back down the spinal cord. And that would take too long. Whereas when you have a reflex, you want to be able to do it as quick as possible to prevent any damage whatsoever. So these spinal reflexes are going to be what allow for that quick response to happen. Looking at the Golgi tendon organ then, if you remember, Golgi tendons are going to be what sends tension in the body, and they're going to reside in the musculotendinous junction, meaning the part where the muscle fibers and the tendons intersect and connect to the bone. So here we zoom in, this is our tendon attachment here to the bone, and this is going to be the muscle fibers here. So these white strands that we see, these are going to be the collagen fibers that make up the tendon connective tissue. And then these green sensory bulbs are going to be the sensory neurons, or the Golgi tendon organs themselves. And because they're embedded within these collagen fibers, when we act on these collagen fibers, they're going to stimulate these sensory neurons. So what's going to happen is, say we're lifting a heavy weight. Because the Golgi tendons are responsible for sensing tension, the more we're trying to lift, the more we're going to activate these Golgi tendon organs. And the reason that happens is we're trying to lift a heavy weight, our muscles contracting, generating more and more tension, and you can see these collagen fibers have now enlarged or been made close together because of the tension. So we lift the weight, the fibers get bigger, and then you can see the sensory receptors that are embedded in these tendons are now being smushed together, and this is what's going to stimulate them and allow them to send their action potential to the spinal cord and say, oh my God, we have too much tension. So excessive tension is going to be what stimulates these Golgi tendon organs. So we can do the same thing as we did last time and look at the pathway. So in blue here is our motor neuron. In green, we have our Golgi tendon organ, so the information is going to be traveling this direction to the spinal cord. Motor neuron is traveling away from the spinal cord. And again, we have that inhibitory neuron. So anytime you have an inhibitory neuron, you know we're trying to tell another neuron to be quiet. In this case, because there's too much tension, we want to tell this motor neuron to settle down and stop firing. So what's going to happen? We're going to, again, be lifting a lot of weight. And as you lift more weight, we're sending more and more signals from that motor neuron to kind of keep that contraction from dropping the weight. So we're getting excessive signals to overcontract, which is dangerous because if you're using your muscle too much, you could physically tear the tendon from the bone, and that's not a situation you want to do. So that's the job of the Golgi tendon organ, to prevent that over excessive pooling on the tendon attachment, which might result in a tearing of the muscle fibers. So because we've now generated too much tension, we're going to stimulate these Golgi tendon organs. So now we find an action potential to the spinal cord. And when this Golgi tendon is stimulated, it's going to in turn stimulate this inhibitory neuron. So when we stimulate the inhibitory neuron, this turns on and it's going to send a stop signal to the motor neuron. So now that this motor neuron cannot send any more signals, we can no longer hold this weight and the muscle is going to relax and you drop the weight. So it's preventing us from overexerting ourselves and causing damage unnecessarily.